So this next video, I found when someone posted it on a Facebook group I'm in. She's called Hannah Cox. I think she was supposed to debate Forsha at one point, but I don't know whether she cancelled. She's not. She says she doesn't want to debate him at all. So whether that was they had a thing they were going to do and then it got cancelled, or whether she just outwardly saying that she wouldn't, I don't even know. But she's a libertarian conservative YouTuber. Or I think maybe she's on TikTok. She's got a bunch of followers on Facebook. She doesn't want to threaten her platform by platforming a pedo or whatever. I have to bleep that out for YouTube purposes. But anyway. She calls herself a libertarian conservative. Her YouTube channel is called Hannah Cox, but her YouTube series is literally just called Based, which is the best kind of example of conservatives thinking they're cool when they just really aren't. Just like, I'm just going to take the cool internet word and I'll be hip and down with the kids, which I think is incredibly funny. But it's essentially, the video is called Antitrust is Anti-Capitalist, which is, again, just so obvious. All these these ANCAP types, who just continually say that when we live in capitalism, but we live in corporatism, not real capitalism, then just are the biggest fucking cucks for corporations in the world. All they do is just allow the rhetoric of the online discourse to be framed in such a way that we give as many concessions to like all of the big corporations that we can do, and say, well, the government can't get involved, but I'm just going to say the corporations are bad and fucking virtue signal about the problem that we all agree with and propose literally no fucking solutions. So her video is called Antitrust is Anti-Capitalist. We're going to expose some libertarians for actually being incredibly pro-corporation, just being cucks to the massive company, the biggest companies on the planet. She's going to be a fucking idiot, and we're going to have a great time critiquing that shit. Let's fucking go.
Hey guys, welcome back to Based. It's January, it's freezing, it's miserable.
God, she's fucking, like, charisma vacuum, this woman is. Did she ever change her intonation in any of those first two sentences?
One place things are heating up, and that's in legislative sessions across the country. For those who don't know, January is what I like to call go time when it comes to public policy. Most states hold their legislative sessions between January to April or May of each year.
Has she got the same fucking video designer as Ben Shapiro, where they have, like, the front-on-face camera, and then they'll do this kind of pan from the right-hand side? I don't know what's going on here. What's Fee? Does she link to Fee in any of her media consultant for a bunch of things, brand ambassador for Fee Online? What's this? Oh, she's a libertarian, like, think tank or whatever. With 41k followers, fucking hell. So yeah, she just that's why. Again, as always, these people are just funded by think tanks at the end of the day.
Year, and the U.S. Congress is also usually meeting during this time too. What does this mean for you? It means you better not blink, because your representatives are hard at work trying to move or kill bills, and I promise you that if you're like me, you won't like even half of it. This year, one issue a lot of those legislative bodies are focusing on is big tech. Now, big tech has become an all-encompassing term that can refer to a wide range of policies representatives are pushing. I'd place things like free speech, Section 230, content moderation.
How has this person got a platform as a political advocate? She's so fucking boring. God.
Data privacy, encryption, and antitrust all in this bucket. And these are all things that I care a lot about as an actual capitalist, so there's a good chance we'll get to all of them on Based at some point. But today, we're going to focus specifically on antitrust. Now, I realize that before we can talk about antitrust, I must first convince you that you're interested in antitrust. And I get it. Literally until last year, I was kind of in your camp. I didn't really know that much about this policy. It seemed very wonky and dry, and you know me, I'm a policy fanatic, so if I think it's wonky and dry, I realize my audience might not be with me yet.
The problem is it's framed in the US as being an antitrust law, which most people just wouldn't get involved with. It's intentionally obscuring and obfuscating the actual issue that these things try to solve. In Europe, in the EU, these are just called anti-monopoly laws because, you know, everyone knows that monopolies are bad. We've all played the board game, right? So we all understand that. So it's interesting that they're called antitrust in the US, which it kind of skirts around actually describing what it does to make sure people don't get involved. People don't have like a proper understanding of it.
But stay with me, because I've been forced to learn about antitrust as a battle.
I mean, she basically is a corporate rep at this point. If she's good, she's a brand ambassador for a libertarian non-profit.
Heats up, and I promise you, it's anything but boring. In fact, I think it sums up some of the biggest debates about governmental philosophy and economic principles out there. So let me make the case for why I think you should care. Before I dig into the history of antitrust laws specifically, I first want to remind you of some material that we covered in previous episodes, especially my episode titled, I Don't Think You Know What Capitalism Is. As I pointed out in that episode, and as I think it has become...
Oh, definitely gonna have to watch that. I wonder at what point she'll ever just mention the means of production.
Abundantly clear throughout each subject we've looked into on Based, our founding fathers did not do enough to enshrine the economic system of capitalism into our laws or constitution. And that is somewhat understandable because
Capitalism is, the ability to privately own the means of production, and the continuation of the commodity form, and also the explicit enshrining of private property rights as well. Simple.
As a set economic theory was just being documented at that time. Adam Smith...
But what she's going to do, she's going to say that what capitalism actually is Randian objectivism. Anything that's anything other than Randian objectivism is just like socialists meddling within the perfect system of capital, right? Well, she's about to mention Adam Smith, so maybe I'm wrong.
Who is known as the father of capitalism, wrote The Wealth of Nations in 1776, the same year our founders wrote the Declaration of Independence. So our system was...
They also said that landlords were bad, so there you go.
It's worth noting here that...
Like Adam Smith looked at the capitalism we have today, like neoliberal capitalism, he'd fucking turn in his grave.
Capitalism is merely the willing trade of goods and services free from government intervention or force, which of course existed long before 1776. But as far as creating a whole capitalist system, the US was...
That's not what capitalism is. That's just called commerce. That's what commerce is. Capitalism is a structure of production that creates commodities with, someone who privately owns the means of production, then people who work underneath them, right? It is a structure of production. It's not the ability to exchange goods and services. That's just commerce.
First up to bat, so some mistakes were made. Our Constitution did implement some structures that were meant to uphold a capitalist system. The protection of private property and court systems that protect contracts being chiefly among them. Our founders also sought to promote free trade and competition, both in their writings and in our legal documents. But I would argue they didn't do enough to ensure our economic system was free from government intervention, which is an essential component for true capitalism. Not only that...
there you go. She said the true capitalism. She's doing exactly what I said she would. In that she would just literally say that you cannot have any government intervention or regulation whatsoever, because it's not true capitalism, so it's just either Randian objectivism or we don't have true capital. That's her only point of view that she has. It's this myopic binary worldview of Randian objectivism or nothing, basically.
But the founders put some things in the Constitution that, there's just no other way to say it, opened the door to massive government infringement in the market, created many of our current problems, and allowed for an economic system that is mixed at best and downright crony most of the time. High on that list of...
Right, so this is where we're going to have to take a little bit of a side note to let people know that capitalism and the state are intrinsically tied together. As she's already stated at the start of this video, and she's correct in stating, in that one of the two major pillars of making sure that capitalism functions is having an adherence to private property rights and having an adherence to contract law. Now, these two things both require a state to function. You need to have a state, you need to have the police with which to enforce these private property rights, which have to be employed on behalf of the state. The state is a necessary component of the function of capitalism. Even in like a minarchist state, right? There's still a very limited, function of the government to maintain these property rights, to maintain contract law, and to function for the emergency service essentially, and to be able to function for the police, right? Even minarchists admit this. And the only reason why capitalism exists in the first place is because that happened on behalf of the state used that to move past feudalism. That's why capitalism exists in the first place. There's never been a stateless capitalist society in the history of the world. That's never a thing that's ever happened, right? So the idea that, the only time we can have true capitalism with no state, or where the state never interferes with anything ever, that's complete nonsense, right? There has to be a state with which to maintain capitalism. And the function of capitalism, especially in a democratic state, is such that to be able to agitate on behalf of capitalism, and on behalf of the people who have the most power within capitalism, who are the people with the most money, because that's the only currency that matters in capitalism, is how much money you have. That's what all social capital essentially runs down to, is how much money you have to be able to, affect the way in which views are perpetuated throughout that particular society. So, for example, you see it at the moment in the capitalist viewpoints are always the most overrepresented, because the media corporations, or the media companies at the very least, who will be able to control the narrative in the media lens, always do so through a pro-capitalist perspective. Even when the state was entirely minimized, the people who would get involved, the people who would be in charge of the state, would be the ones who would be able to make specific prescriptions on what should and shouldn't happen based on the interests of capitalism, because those people who control the narrative. So these states are always going to tend towards the benefit of the people with the most money, right? So that's why the state exists within capitalism in such a bad way, and why it's even worse during neoliberalism is because it explicitly exists to protect the interests of corporations rather than regular people. That's the Marxist perspective.
The Commerce Clause, which gives Congress the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and amongst the states. We could probably have debates around whether or not the Commerce Clause has any standing in a capitalist worldview whatsoever, but what is certain is that our courts have used this clause to hang most of their crony expansions of government power into the market on, especially since the Wickard versus Filburn case in 1942, where the Supreme Court ruled an activity does not have to have a direct effect on interstate commerce to fall within the commerce power as long as the effect is substantial and economic. Tremendous.
So, and the vast majority of the laws that these people hate, these are laws that are there to protect the working class. These are laws that weren't just put for the government because they hated corporations or they hated commerce. They were there to protect working class and were agitated for by unions, by socialists, by communists, right? These were all, things that were done on behalf of... I didn't switch the window there, whatever, that's fine. She's only just speaking to a camera or whatever, doesn't really matter. But it's clear that the reason why people like her want these laws repealed is not for some love of genuine capitalism and the way this has failed society. It's because they lobby on behalf of non-profits who want the most money to go to the corporations as possible, and to be able to do that, they have to be able to circumvent laws that protect working people, that protect the people on the bottom rung of the ladder. Because at the end of the day, that is their worldview. It's fucking over the little guy to generate corporate profits, because that's what these people are paid to propagandize to you.
I would argue Congress should never have been given any power over commerce in the first place, and I racked my brain on this. I called a few smart friends, and I Googled around while I was writing this episode. I can't find anything that convincingly argues why they should have this power. If you have an argument, leave it in the comments. But I think if I were to find a legitimate reason...
Well, I just gave it to you. Protecting working people, there you go.
...for Congress to have regulatory power over commerce, I would still say that the Commerce Clause was badly written. It's too broad. If there are legitimate reasons Congress needs regulatory control over certain areas of commerce, those should have been narrowly defined in the Constitution, as this document is, again, meant to restrain the government.
The problem is that these things would have happened, what things that they would need to regulate is going to be different in different times and periods. Why would something that happened in the 1700s have the same kind of framework that would need to be applied in current year? These are two completely separate paradigms you're trying to compare here. That's why having such a set constitution is just a bonkers idea, and I don't know why Americans continue to defend it. Like, things are always different in different time periods. You need to have different sets of legislations and laws and regulations and freedoms depending on what particular time that you live in, right? These are all situational. These are all dependent on the material conditions of society. Again, I understand all these people are fucking idealist idiots who think that everything it can only be done based on the idea and based on the principles that guide what's happening rather than the material consequences. But again, I would say these people are fucking idiots, and that I guess it doesn't fit into my own moral prescriptions as a consequentialist. But I digress.
And list out its small and limited number of powers. So they needed to be more specific to prevent the gross expansion of power we've seen under the Commerce Clause. Please do not underestimate the effects of these missteps by our founders. The kind of crony capitalism our politicians are allowed to get away with because of them.
Also, yeah, as I said before, crony capitalism is just capitalism. There is always going to be a state, regardless of what happens, and the capitalists are always going to be able to use the state to further their own ends, because in capitalism... Especially neoliberal capitalism, the people with the most power are the people with the most money, and that's why lobbying happens. That's always going to happen. That's never, you just saying, oh, that's just crony capitalism, so it's bad. I'm like, well, at least we agree that it's bad, but you need to admit that it's just a function of capitalism.
Major havoc in our economy and our lives. While capitalism is the willing exchange of goods and services without government intervention, cronyism...
No, capitalism is the private ownership of the means of production, the adherence to private property rights, and the continuation of the commodity form. That's like the free trade. That's free trade, right? The idea of free trade without government intervention is exactly what you're saying that it is. That's called a free market. That's just free trade. That's just commerce. That's just free commerce. There's a difference between that and capitalism. Like, you can still have a socialist business, like a socialist structure of businesses within a market system, right? I've been an advocate for market socialism. I know that's become a meme because Vorsh says that it's correct, right? I know it's become a meme to hate on market socialism, but Yugoslavia was great. Like, it fixes a bunch of the problems that we have. That's the big issue that we have. Right? Even with those socialist markets, even though the government is regulating the way the firms can be structured, that doesn't necessarily mean that the government is explicitly trying to they can then explicitly engage in rules which regulate who can trade with whom, right? There's a difference between regulating commodity markets and regulating labour markets. And in essence, within market socialism, all you're regulating is labour markets rather than regulating the commodity market. That's the issue that we have here. And she's trying to say that regulating commodity markets is necessarily anti-capitalist, where no, it's just anti-free trade. And I could give you arguments against free trade. I don't think that it's necessarily a good thing, because there are sometimes externalities that would need to be regulated, right? But again, these are all idealists. They just think that as long as there's principles they're at play here, that's all we need to care about is principles. Well, no, material impact is what actually matters.
Or crony capitalism is a system where most people and businesses have to compete, fail, or succeed in the market based on their merits, but where the friends of those in the government get special favors. Those special favors can look like corporate welfare, bailouts, selective tax breaks, or regulation.
Well, at least we agree that a bunch of subsidy towards specific friends of the government who happen to lobby is a bad thing. At least we both agree on that.
And this is where the American people get played so easily, because politicians and those who benefit from regulations follow a very simple playbook that it seems the vast majority of people just can't keep up with. They'll show you an example, one emotional story in a country with 330 million people. It's a total outlier. And they'll say, see, look what happened to this person. This is why we must do something to protect the health and safety of society, or you could be next. And most people go, oh my God, I might be next. Save me, daddy government. And then they come in and regulate whatever it is that they've convinced you is such a threat. But here's what happens behind.
Yeah, but are you not just doing the same thing by saying, well, these people aren't a threat, and I'm going to try and convince you they're not a threat, even though there is, a genuine material impact of things that they engage in. For example, I don't know, the climate crisis. She's trying. That's what she's. I think that's pretty reasonable for me to try and state that that's the kind of Trojan horse that she's trying to do here, where she's essentially saying that the government has convinced you that climate change is an issue, so we need to regulate all of the big oil corporations. I'm like, okay. That doesn't change the science. The government are trying to tell you why that is, so that it justifies the changes they need to make sure that the planet doesn't burn down.
Behind the scenes in that scenario, the lawmaker sees an industry making a lot of money, and they say, you know what? I'd like to get my hands on that. I think I could run it better because I'm so smart and powerful. And then that's not the issue. The issue isn't that the government wants to make the money. They still get the same paycheck at the end of the day. That's not what happens when, say, for example, something gets nationalized. What really happens, especially in the case of nationalization, I know that's not explicitly what she's saying, but I'm an advocate for nationalization for markets such as things with incredibly inelastic price curves, like housing or utilities and things like that, is that it is much better run at the consumer end for the people than it is on the if it is being done with the national interest in mind, right? Because corporations do not have the national interest in mind; they have a single interest in mind, and that is the profits being driven for their shareholders, rather than the actual interests of the people who end up consuming. Again, this is a fundamental critique of the Marxian law of value, in that what is necessarily good for producers, the exchange value, the increased exchange value, does not change the fundamental use value of the commodity at the end of the day, right? And that's why especially when the price curves are inelastic, I'm not saying that everything should be nationalised, I'm not a fucking state socialist or whatever, I'm not saying that we need to nationalise sausages. Oh, whatever. They can continue speaking into the void. I'm not gonna recognize the shit they're saying. They'll get bored eventually. Because obviously there are plenty of very, very elastic markets that work particularly well. Food isn't one of these things. We have an incredibly large overabundance of food, especially in the West. Obviously, that's a consequence of imperialism, but even without the imperialism, and even with a global change in supply chains that meant that it wasn't entirely disparate, the ways in which this food was distributed between the global north and the global south, we would still have an abundance of food to be able to feed everyone on the planet. That's just a fact, right? Everyone can be fed on the planet based on the current levels of production that we have, and the market incentives are pretty good for that. Market incentives have shown that prices can be kept low with an incentive to continually increase production. That's why I don't really agree with something like price controls on things like food or whatever. That's absolutely fine. When it comes to something like housing, where land is something with a fixed supply, the housing supply is very inelastic and the demand is completely inelastic because everyone needs at least one. That's where the market fails, and then why I think that for the good of the people who need to have houses, because it's a fundamental human right, the state should come in and be able to take control of that market with which to deliver for the actual use value of the commodity, to be able to satisfy the human need of the people who just need a place to live in, right? So that's why these things are different. Lawmaker's friend says, you know what? Those people in that industry are my competitors, and I don't really want to compete. I want to stay at the top of my game and kick back at the same time. Let's partner. And together...
I don't know, she's talking about people lobbying the government to implement market restrictions that favour against their competitors and then using their money to buy the government. I'm like, yes, that is bad. Welcome to capitalism. Welcome to capitalism. The state has to exist. They can use their money to influence the state. That's just how capitalism works, unfortunately. I'm sorry.
They draft regulations that hurt smaller competitors in this industry, give the lawmaker more power over the existing companies to feed their God complex, and end up giving the government more money, both through the fines and steady donations from their friends in the industry. But they don't tell you all of that, because you probably wouldn't go for it. Instead, they convince you that the businesses are the enemy, and that only government can save you from them, as if the government has ever saved anybody from anything.
No, but they're lobbying on behalf of other businesses in your example that you're giving here, right? That's the big difference.
Who do you think writes regulations? It's almost always the lawyers and lobbyists for the top firms in the industry being regulated.
As I said before, the businesses are the enemy. The businesses are the one who are putting shareholder profits above the interests of the regular population. I'm not saying that the US government is putting the regular people's interests, because again, both of the American parties are completely cucked to corporations, because there's no proper socialist party. There is just the right-wing party and the centrist party, both of whom are just corporate-owned, right? It's not like in the UK, where you have like a corporation-funded party and a union-funded party who work on completely disparate interests. Obviously, Starmer notwithstanding, that's not the issue that you have here. You have two particular parties who are both completely, essentially being captured by corporations, who are both using their platform to make lives better for business owners rather than the working class. Right? That's the difference, is that you just don't like, who the Democrats are giving credence to rather than who the Republicans are giving credence to, because that's what these people just agitate for.
And they write them to stack the deck in their favor and against all of us. This is like politics 101. Now, all of that...
Against all of us? Is regulations on union busting, for example, is that in the interest of all of us, or is that only in the interest of corporations?
Might seem like a bit of a tangent, but I promise you it's stuff you need to know as a foundation for the subject matter. So back to antitrust. First, here is the official Wikipedia definition of antitrust laws. In the United States, antitrust law is a collection of mostly federal laws that regulate the conduct and organization of business corporations and are generally intended to promote competition and prevent monopolies.
Based, 100%, let's go. That's good. That's a good regulation.
Sure, Jan. Now that you have the definition and the foundation, let's trace back the history. The US did not have antitrust laws until 1890, just wasn't a thing. But in 1890, we get the Sherman Act, which was upheld by, you guessed it, the Commerce Clause. And here's where antitrust gets confusing, because it sounds very capitalist in its intentions. According to the government, this law outlines every
the problem is it's just a fucking stupid fucking framing of her complete conflation of capitalism and commerce here, which is incredibly frustrating. Like, it's pro-commerce, it's pro-competition, which is good in, if you're going to have a market economy, competition is a necessity with which to bring prices down. But as I said before, there are plenty of industries and plenty of markets in which competition does not affect prices in the way that she's trying to say that it does. So, as I said, housing is an interesting one, because it's very difficult to be able to compete when land is in an incredibly fixed supply, and you can't really change the dynamics of the market to be able to fit with demand because of how inelastic the supply is, and also that's inelastic on the demand end too. For example, you can't create competition, I don't know, on like the rail networks, like when they got privatized. Even Thatcher didn't want to privatize the rail networks. That's a John Major issue. But privatizing, you can't create competition on a line that is fixed, where you either get on the train or you don't. Like, especially in the UK, where franchisees own different stations, so there are plenty of stations where only one rail network will even stop at them, so you don't even have any consumer choice. There's no competition there, and monopolies are bad for the same reason, and that there is no incentive to keep prices down when there's no competition trying to beat you to the consumer. And that's why antitrust laws are good, but that's pro-commerce, that's not pro-capitalist specifically.
Combination or conspiracy and restraint of trade, and any monopolization, attempted monopolization, or conspiracy or combination to monopolize.
The dumbest thing about the people in chat, I'm gonna address the people in chat one singular time. I live in the fucking Britain. Why are you talking about Trump in my chat? Are you fucking stupid?
Sounds good. We like competition. We like trade. Monopolies are bad. Sounds like a pro-capitalist law, right? No, not so fast. I've linked a very lengthy piece of research in my show notes.
Here is some incredibly verbose reasoning that I have, which is why all the money going to the corporations is good.
Around the dynamics and the motivations at play during the passage of this law, and things were not so...
Don't care about the motivations, I just care about the material consequences. Please give me the material consequences.
Black and white. In fact, its author, Senator Sherman, was a very pro-tariff guy. the little things government uses to actually hinder free trade. And he was working to protect, or at the very least distract, from Congress's very high tariffs on trade at the time. Fun fact, tariffs are another form of protectionism where governments try to penalize some buyers and sellers at the expense of others. Not so free market.
I mean, I'm glad that she's such a cuck for globalism as well. And it's just like, yeah, the great thing about opposing tariffs mean that all of your jobs can get outsourced to developing countries. Like, isn't it great how you all the working class can lose their jobs to manufacturing jobs in the global south because there's no protectionism on the way in which jobs are being outsourced?
The Institute says this: the Sherman Act was bad law. It not only preserved the nation's high tariff policies by diverting attention away from the root restraint of trade, it greased the wheels for another tariff law later the same year, the McKinley Tariff Act of 1890. With tariffs and antitrust, the government at best was trying to undo with one hand what it was doing with the other. But at worst, as applications of the law would demonstrate, the Sherman Act discouraged scale economies that promoted lower costs and prices, penalized successful market entrepreneurship, and rewarded the political entrepreneurship of less efficient business rivals. It's weird how they never tell you their true motivations for these things. I wonder if that's still going on. And so we end up with our modern antitrust structure. To more specifically define what this looks like, I'm just going to read from the Federal Trade Commission, or the FTC's, website, as this is the agency that mostly upholds and enforces antitrust laws. The Sherman Act does not prohibit every restraint of trade, only those that are unreasonable. For instance, an agreement between two individuals to form a partnership restrains trade, but may not do so unreasonably. On the other hand, certain acts are considered so harmful to competition that they are almost always illegal. These include arrangements among competing individuals or businesses to fix prices, divide markets, or rig bids. The penalties for violating the Sherman Act can be severe. Although most enforcement actions are civil, the Sherman Act is also a criminal law, and individuals and businesses that violate it may be prosecuted by the Department of Justice.
Based. I'm gonna say that just this once during this video.
So there you have it. Two unelected bureaucratic agencies, the Department of Justice and the FTC, have a crazy amount of
I mean, but these people are selected by the democratically elected people, right? So you are still lending credence to whoever's ever put into these roles when you select your government.
Power to fine, prosecute, and persecute individuals and businesses in the US under antitrust laws. I wonder what could
Good, let's fucking go!
go wrong. And for about 10 years, actually nothing went wrong. Hardly any cases were brought under this act, and most that were did not succeed. But then comes Teddy Roosevelt in the early 1900s, and he fashions himself a trust buster. But really, he tended to favor regulating companies versus actually breaking them up. Under Roosevelt, we do have the first big antitrust case, though. In a 1904 decision, the Supreme Court upheld the federal government's lawsuit to dissolve the Northern Securities Company, which was a railroad holding company. That was in a case called State of Minnesota versus Northern Securities Company. William Howard Taft followed Roosevelt in 1908, and he rejected Roosevelt's regulatory strategy and vigorously pursued
Boo! Boo Taft! We hate Taft! Repeal Taft-Hartley Act now! Bad anti-union laws. Fuck off, Taft. We hate you.
actually breaking companies up in the courts. In Taft's single term, the Justice Department almost doubled the number of antitrust lawsuits brought under Roosevelt's 2 terms. Then, in 1911, after years of litigation, the court found Standard Oil Company of New Jersey in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act because of its excessive restrictions on trade, particularly its practice of eliminating competitors by buying them out directly and by driving them out of business by temporarily slashing prices in a given region. And in this decision, they set a really important legal precedent that says that a large size and monopoly in and of themselves are not necessarily bad and do not violate the Sherman Antitrust Act. Rather, it is the use of certain tactics to attain or preserve such position that is illegal. And this was the precedent used for decades in evaluating lawsuits brought under antitrust. Then in 1914, Congress passes the
I mean, if you're just saying that the antitrust laws didn't go far enough in breaking up monopolies, but just were used in a poor way, then your argument isn't that antitrust is bad. Your argument is that the laws need to be changed.
The Antitrust Act, which strengthens earlier antitrust legislation. The act prohibits anti-competitive mergers, predatory and discriminatory pricing, and other forms of unethical corporate behavior.
Good, let's go.
Also passed the Federal Trade Commissions Act that year, which creates and establishes a commission that is able to 1. Prevent unfair methods of competition and unfair or deceptive acts or practices in or affecting commerce. 2. Seek monetary redress and other relief for conduct injurious to consumers. 3. Prescribe rules defining with specificity acts or practices that are unfair or deceptive. 4. Gather and compile information and conduct investigations relating to the organization, business, practices, and management of entities engaged in commerce. And 5. Make reports and legislative recommendations to Congress.
Who's being convinced by this? This seems like really bad corporate propaganda. If you're just sitting there just like reading off a bunch of laws by like, well, I have to do like 10 minutes of like explaining as to why this... Like, who's getting convinced by this?
And the public.
Especially saying like, oh no, well, this is bad, we we can't do things that are good for consumers, when the vast majority of people watching this are consumers who need to be convinced that shilling for corporations is good.
That is a lot of power for political appointees to have over private industry. So now you see the government has a ton of regulatory power over businesses and a very big stick to use. Essentially, you have to run things.
But you're not explaining why any of those consequences are bad. So you're just saying, this is regulation. Regulation is bad because I say so, when actually regulation's really fucking based.
The way they want you to, or they're going to fine you millions of dollars and maybe even take your company or put you in jail. That's not cool. And that is high-key not capitalist. But antitrust enforcement still didn't really...
Again, she's taking this is anti-capitalist, so it's bad, as some kind of objective viewpoint, rather than your opinion, and also something that you need to be able to back up with appealing to the group of the base that you need to try and convince on this issue. Like, if you're working for like a corporate non-profit or a pro-corporation non-profit, then what you should be doing with your time and with your energy and with your resources is trying to change people's minds on these particular things. People who were previously were not invested in protecting the needs of corporations, which is what these puff pieces are supposed to do. They need to have their minds changed. I just don't know whose mind is being changed by this very, very dry, boring video. It's also wrong.
1920s and 1930s, probably because the government was doing too much other stuff to mess with the market under FDR during that time. One example of that is the Public Utility Holding Company Act of 1935, also known as the Wheeler-Rayburn Act, which was a U.S. federal law giving the Securities and Exchange Commission authority to regulate, license, and break up electric utility holding companies. And there were
good. Utilities are an inelastic market. Break up the inelastic markets. Like the barrier for entry as a new starter in these industry is already so high. The only other people who are going to be able to compete in that market are also amongst the very rich. There's the idea that you're going to create some kind of utility startup to compete with the big players and undercut them in the market. That's just nonsense. That's just not how these markets work. That's why these laws are so useful, being able to regulate these things. That's why Ofgem in the UK and why regulations on, for example, energy prices are incredibly important, like what you're seeing going on in France, because there's the idea that someone's going to come in and just compete in this market with EDF Energy, other than just a couple of other incredibly large other corporations, is just nonsense. And that's why these anti-monopolies laws are incredibly useful, because when you have a natural monopoly like something like energy or utilities or infrastructure, the only small number of companies that are competing in this market can then rig the game in their favour by price fixing, by merging, etc., etc. And why these antitrust laws and anti-monopoly laws are just good in their essence, because of these markets that are naturally uncompetitive.
Or kind of bills like this that were passed during these decades. You did see some major antitrust lawsuits, like against the film and camera company Kodak, which at one point held a 96% share of the market. But as you'll see is so often the case with companies that are targeted under antitrust, if you just wait around a few years, they're usually not the top dog in the industry anymore. And here's why.
Oh, I guess if they're just usually not the top dog, I guess we can just throw all the laws out the window that have any kind of consumer protections, because any of these other things that happens doesn't happen. Who cares? It's not my problem. It doesn't usually happen, apart from the time, all of the times when it does. Yeah, like, this is just incredibly dry. I said at the start of the video, like, she's sped up here. This is at 1.25 times speed. I was like, this woman is just a charisma vacuum who's convincing literally nobody.
True monopolies do not and cannot exist without government support. Because in an actual free market, you don't need government to protect competition. Competition springs up naturally and will eat the dinosaurs.
There you go. Right, we found it. We found the worst part of this video, the bit where she just doesn't understand how natural monopolies work, doesn't understand how market elasticity works, and she doesn't quite understand how supply chains work. Like, we do need all the colourful pictures, true, and the graphs, we need, like, the silly graphs that don't make any sense with, like, poorly labelled axes. That would have made this video way better. But she just doesn't quite, she probably does understand these things, but she knows that her viewership doesn't understand it, so that when she tries to convince them as to why increasing corporate power is a good thing, that they wouldn't check. They wouldn't understand. They wouldn't have the points with which to be able to respond to this issue, right? Like, the ways in which economies of scale only really benefit the largest corporations in the world, so to which they can push out other people from the market. And these predatory business practices will almost certainly be engaged in without government regulation. If you watch the Shaun video, How PragerU Lies to You, he talks a lot about this when he has this example of how an unregulated tulip market in the Netherlands essentially spiraled prices out of control. It's an interesting video.
Industry that fail to innovate or meet consumer demands. It is inevitable. We rarely throughout our history have seen true monopolies, and even when they do occur, they have always been thanks to government regulations, corporate welfare, subsidies, and other anti-capitalist actions. So we don't need government to
citation. Sorry, I need to do it the proper way. Citation. Needed!
Protect competition under antitrust. We need it to quit screwing with competition in the market in the first place. Per usual, they're creating the problems they purport to be fixing. Another thing you'll find throughout the history of antitrust is that these laws are rarely used to actually break
Again, just no citations for that. Like, nothing at all. Like, do you think that Amazon got into the position that they did because of government subsidy? Not really.
monopolies. One, because they're kind of the Bigfoot in this whole charade, and two, because it isn't actually about competition. Antitrust is about the government getting power over the market and money out of it. What's known as the golden era.
No, not true. It's entirely about competition. I'm sorry. It just always has been about competition in the market. You've not proved any of this. You've not shown us any information or data. You've just said here are some laws that happened which were bad for some businesses, but it's bad because it regulates the market, and regulating the market is bad because I say it is, and then said, well, actually, monopolies very rarely exist without government support, without providing any evidence at all.
Era of antitrust takes place in the 1940s through the 1970s. And just know that if progressives and government officials refer to any time period as the golden era, what I think they mean is they were getting paid. Again, they rarely have ever actually breaking up companies.
Spoiler alert, there was no golden era ever in the United States. It's not. It's just bad. It's just bad. Whereas it's also almost like all of the regulations that exist in, I don't know, social democratic countries have just led to a happier populace, a more equal populace, a consumer base which has a higher level of spending power and a higher quality of life because of these regulations and high union power that's been in place since time immemorial.
During this time, instead they're more so fining and regulating them to bits. A few famous cases include one in 1948 around Paramount Pictures, which said film studios could not own movie theaters or force them to buy films. In 1945, you had an antitrust case against a company called Alcoa.
That's good. That's good that there should be competition amongst film studios, amongst cinemas. That's a good thing.
About 90% of the aluminum industry, and Congress went after them. But there were questions about the specific kind of aluminum they produced and whether or not that actually represented their real market share. So this case went on for years. But by the time it was finally settled, the company was not broken up or fined because guess what? Competition had already handled the matter with many new competitors entering their market. Good Lord, it's almost like we don't need the government in this situation. And in 1960.
To be fair, that is just an anecdote. But let me actually Google this case. Let's have a look. USA Aluminium and Antitrust. Let's see what the veracities of these claims that she's making. Let's actually do some groundwork for this. Mining dollar. Let's go to the Reuters. When was this? 2014. US lawyers spearheading an antitrust lawsuit accusing Wall Street banks and commodity merchants of manipulating aluminium prices will continue to fight the case. Oh, that's an old article. This one dismisses aluminium antitrust claims. Let's go to mining.com. Let's find some citations as to why this was. Was it the market fixing things or was it something else? Narrowed long-running antitrust case where aluminium purchasers accused Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan Chase, and mining company Glencore of conspiring to drive up the metal's price by reducing supply. Many purchasers lacked standing to sue because they had bought aluminium primarily from smelters such as Alcoa and Rio Tinto Alcan rather than directly from the defendants, and this does not qualify as efficient enforcers of antitrust laws. Purchasers accused banks and commodity trading, mining, metals, warehousing companies of conspiring to hoard aluminium when prices were low roughly a decade ago. It was nothing to do with the market fixing anything. It's just that, they were accusing somebody of hoarding aluminium when they weren't, right? But you could admit that, but say, for example, they were hoarding aluminium, and that was proven to be that they were, but you didn't have the antitrust law, then these people would be engaging in things, and the laws would have been useful in this situation. This isn't a situation of the antitrust law being bad because it was put in place on someone who didn't deserve it. It's a case of these people didn't deserve it in the first place, so the antitrust law wasn't relevant then. But it would have been relevant had they been engaging it in the first place. Let's have a look. Investigation began in 2013. Yeah, so that's not an argument against the antitrust laws. That's just an argument against the antitrust laws being applied to people who don't violate them. Like, what?
C6 case called United States versus Vaughn's Grocery Company, the Supreme Court held that a merger between two Los Angeles area grocery store chains with a combination local market share of approximately 8% violated the Clayton Act. A year later, they blocked Procter & Gamble from acquiring Clorox. I mean, honestly, our heroes. But by the 1970s, things
Yeah? Procter & Gamble are fucking massive. They absolutely should have the ability to form mergers regulated.
start to cool off. Those on the left will blame this on the increasing popularity of the Chicago School of Economics and its prominence in the Reagan administration, but others say this is because proof was in the pudding. Look at the 1970s economy. Things were not great. You had rampant stagflation, which means the economy was stalled, innovation and growth were lagging, and prices were also rising. And this was, of course, due to many bad economic decisions and governmental policies that we've covered in other episodes of Base, but a business climate where titans of industry, you know, the people who actually make stuff and create jobs, are constantly being stalked.
I'm just gonna let that shit hang in the air for 1 second. Job creators?
And threatened and penalized for just doing their jobs. Turns out that's not so great of an environment for the economy. But thankfully, around this time, the economy gets some relief from some pretty solid legal jurisprudence known as the Consumer Welfare Standard. And this was developed by scholars at the University of Chicago and championed by a man named Robert Bork, who was a famed
Oh, Chicago School of Economics fucking end me.
conservative legal scholar. As the theory grew in prominence, more and more judges adapted it, baking it into our legal precedent, which, as a reminder, is how most courts determine cases. Rather than looking back at the original intent of the law, they instead look at the previous.
I mean, there's a really great video I watched on stream by Echo Gecko talking about how the changes in economic functioning have led to the levels of poverty and inequality that we have at the moment. So it's worth watching. I'll link it in the description.
Decisions in similar cases, known as the legal precedent, and then they rule off of that. I largely don't agree with this way of reading the law, but it's known as stare decisis if you want to look into it further. Anyways, the Consumer Welfare Standard slowly becomes the dominant legal precedent by the 1980s, and it basically says that when determining matters of antitrust, the standard should be, is the company a monopoly? Has it used its monopoly power? And has it used its monopoly power in a way that harms
Oh, so we are in favour of antitrust laws then. Oh, okay, well this fucking video is pointless. It should just be, if you want to actually title the video properly, it should have just been, we need to change the way the antitrust laws that we had previously were bad, but we've changed the antitrust laws to be good because monopolies are bad. Because you understand that monopolies are bad. Oh, come on.
consumers. If you can't already tell by this episode, I don't support antitrust laws, period. But if we are to have them, then I think this is the right compromise, and the standards should be baked into our law, which Congress has never done. Other countries do antitrust quite differently than us and have worse results. They tend to base their decisions on whether or not a company acted in a manner hostile to competition. What the heck does that even mean? The very nature of being in business
Hostile to the nature of competition, or hostile to competitors.
is competition, and that means you want to see yourself do better than others in your market. And that drive is what makes people work harder to become better, win an audience, or develop a product.
This is you can't even argue with it without even framing it correctly. Like, hostile to the act of being able to compete, right? Which involves in market manipulation on behalf of the people with the power with which to do so. So, for example, I don't know, forming a monopoly.
But in many countries, they penalize the actual competitive nature of business. And that's why you'll see things like Google getting massive fines in Europe for presenting its products first in search results. It's ludicrous. And again, proof is in the pudding. Look at Europe's economy. Far less.
I mean, I'm happy with that. Again, this is them using their huge market share to then influence further market share. Like, this is anti-competitive. I think this is a good fine, and I like the EU. They did one of the very few good things that they did do, was just, like, hand massive fines to huge businesses, which is, I just think that's good.
Growth, innovation, and fewer companies. All right, let's speed rush through the next 40 years to get us to the modern era. In 1984, we see the government actually break a company up, which was AT&T. It was broken up into US West, Ameritech, NYNEX, Bell South, and some others that you notice are not around anymore, while AT&T still is, because maybe they were just better at their jobs. Under Clinton, the government went after Microsoft.
Oh yeah, the only possible way of being able to describe that phenomenon. That's just what happened. It's like AT&T were just better. I'm sure everyone who's ever dealt with AT&T. I'm not even from the US, and even I know that AT&T are garbage and everybody hates them. Even I know that. It's just unfortunate that something like something like telecommunications is an incredibly naturally monopolistic market, because of the way in which it functions and the barrier to entry for these people, and because of the probably still larger market share that was taken up by AT&T at that time.
Because they were selling software with Internet Explorer already installed and you couldn't delete it.
But again, this this is an argument, not really for antitrust laws. This isn't just an argument for nationalisation. I'm sorry, this is an argument for British Telecom.
Could you install other search engines? Yes. But did you have to be aware Internet Explorer existed? Also, yes. So the government decided that this was a case for them. They actually won their stupid lawsuit, but by the time
So if the antitrust law is bad, then AT&T would have died. But no, the AT&T that got broken up is the thing that's bad.
it ended, Bush was in office, and I guess not completely off his rocker in this regard. So they settled with Microsoft, who agreed to share its application programming interface as a compromise.
That's a good point, Ossia. I'm glad I have you in chat. You always seem super informed whenever these things come up. So let me go over the things that she mentioned.
Broken up into US West, Ameritech.
US West, Ameritech. Let me have a look. Several regional operating companies merged with Q West. Let's have a look. This is the rest of the ones she's going on.
NYNEX, Bell South, and some others that you noticed.
So was Q West something that was I mentioned who she thinks the some others are. Acquired by CenturyLink. These people just got absorbed by other telecommunications companies. Like, sure. And so this again, she was acquired by the brand was acquired by somebody else. They're replaced by the other brand and then merged with something else. Brilliant. So they all are just still around, just under different names. What was the other one she mentioned there?
The government actually break a company up, which was AT&T. They penalized the next 40 years to get us to the modern era. In 1984, we see the government actually break a company up, which was AT&T. It was broken up into US West, Ameritech, NYNEX.
NYNEX. Merged with Bell Atlantic, now Verizon. So it is still around. It just got merged into another massive corporation because that's how capitalism works. Because competition is bad for business. Like, so disingenuous, so dishonest.
Bell South and some others that you notice are not around anymore, while AT&T still is, because maybe they were just better at their jobs. Under Clinton, the government went after Microsoft because they were selling software with Internet Explorer already installed and you couldn't delete it. Could you install other search engines? Yes. But did you have to be aware Internet Explorer existed? Also, yes. So the government decided that this was a case for them. They actually won their stupid lawsuit, but by the time it ended, Bush was in office, and I guess not completely off his rocker in this regard. So they settled with Microsoft, who agreed to share its application programming interface as a compromise. Since then, there has not been a successful monopoly prosecution in the US, but the government did go after Apple in 2012, and the company had to pay $450 million in damages for approaching book publishers and offering to let them sell their books for more than Amazon's fixed price and letting them keep more of their profits. The horror. And that brings us to the...
I guess I have to fact check another thing. Apple lawsuit 2012. That's 2021 now. I was going for 2012. DOJ sues Apple over price fixing scheme. Reached an agreement with 5 publishers to release books on its then new iBookstore. The DOJ said Apple colluded to raise the price of ebooks with CBS. It's just price fixing. This action drove up ebook prices virtually overnight. When companies enter agreements to prevent price competition, that's illegal. Why the market shrugged off the Apple Antitrust lawsuit. This should be interesting. That's interesting. I didn't know that. I mean, it did sound kind of frivolous, like just randomly antitrust over Internet Explorer being pre-installed. That seems like a bad application of this law. But again, that's not an argument for getting rid of the laws entirely. It's an argument for changing how the laws function. separate settlement each of the 3 publishers who pay restitution to affected ebook customers in the participating states. DAG pointed to Steve Jobs' biography to argue that Apple knew the scheme would result in higher costs for consumers. Well, that's fine. Just protecting consumers. There you go.
Modern day antitrust movement, which is dominated by hand-wringing over big tech. Honestly, this is the first real push for major antitrust action we've seen in decades, and it's being driven by people on both the far left and the far right, both of whom are working to appeal to populist sentiments. In case you're new here, people are mad at big tech. Democrats think tech companies should censor people more, be able to stop the spread of fake news, which of course they want to be determined by their fact checkers, and stop helping people they don't like organize politically online. Republicans want the companies to censor less, to promote their political views, and as best I can tell, really want Donald Trump back on Twitter. It's not a list of demands, but I'm just reporting what I see. To that end, a group of bipartisan lawmakers in Congress and many throughout state legislatures are routinely introducing legislation to break up, undercut, fine, and regulate tech companies. Here's a summary of some of the policies and actions being taken under the antitrust mantle at this moment. In 2019, the Department of Justice reportedly launched an investigation into Google for antitrust violations because too many people use
this video is 25 minutes long, and it's just been these 2 shots of her talking at a camera.
It for their search engine. There are literally dozens of search engines we all have free and easy access to, including things like DuckDuckGo, Internet Explorer, Safari, Firefox, the list goes on. But since 70% of Americans still choose Google, they're on the chopping block. For what? Offering fast, intuitive browsers? Are you kidding? I unilaterally use Apple products.
The Microsoft antitrust was bigger because Microsoft made deals with hardware manufacturers like IBM to make it harder to install Office competitors. Wow, I didn't know that. That's fucked. But again, it just shows how much weight these people can have the power in the market. And you see Apple do the same thing in their exclusivity deals with people, things like Logic, the ways in which the peripherals just don't even work much better on. Some peripherals that aren't made specifically for Apple will work worse on Apple machines. The planned obsolescence they put into the iPhones to break just before the new ones come out, and even changing the software by updating the old models to make them run slower to force you then to upgrade as well. So this it just shows that so many large companies will just engage in nefarious business practices because they can, because they have that's what market share does.
And on every single one, I willingly seek out and download Chrome because it is a better product. This is the epitome of a nanny state, seeking to tell consumers that the government knows better when it comes to what products they want to use. It's honestly insulting. And then on the legislative front, Amy Klobuchar, who's a Democratic senator, is pushing a bill that would reform our antitrust standards and make them look more like Europe's. Where they fine people for raking their products first. In a statement, she said, as dominant digital platforms...
Good and based, let's go.
Some of the biggest companies our world has ever seen increasingly give preference to their own products and services. We must put policies in place to ensure small businesses and entrepreneurs still have the opportunity to succeed in the digital marketplace. So basically, she doesn't think Amazon Prime should be able to show you their generic cheaper products when you search for something on their website. But ironically, she doesn't...
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that it should all be just done differently, in the same way that it's bad that Spotify use their platform to play when they go to a bunch of suggested music. There's a bunch of it that's been created by Spotify, so they try and get you to listen to things that they've created themselves, so they don't have to pay our royalties to artists.
Keep that same energy for Target, which just happens to be headquartered in her...
A miraculous. There's a person called Hannah Cox. I saw someone post something about her on Facebook. She said she wasn't going to want to debate Vorsh on something. I don't know. But I went through her videos, and I understand that Libertarians are just cucks for corporations. That's all they are, really. They just want to maximize corporate power to then affect consumers and the workers primarily. But they want to try and cloak their genuine viewpoints amongst this just kind of general anti-government, anti-establishment viewpoint, which is not the case. They're just cucks for corporations.
Her district, and which also sells generic brands that it gives priority placement to. You see how they pick winners and losers in this game, right? This kind of policy...
So the argument then is to do it for both, not do it for neither.
It actively hurts consumers. She's working to prevent us from having better, cheaper options, even when we're actively seeking them out. This serves no one but the competitors of big tech companies and the politicians who collect from them. Not only that...
So you're saying that competing with big tech is a bad thing?
But guess what else this legislation would do? It would give a lot more power to those unelected bureaucrats I mentioned at the FTC and DOJ. Yikes. Do you know who currently runs those agencies? Because I do, and they are extremely far left, as you might expect in the Biden administration.
Extremely far left? In the Biden administration? I'm not sure about that one, Chief.
Yet she's joined on this bill by Republicans like Lindsey Graham and Josh Hawley. Cronyism is rampant in both major parties. Less pressing but still worth pointing out are things like the Ending Platform Monopolies Act, which is seeking a structural breakup of Amazon, which is honestly just ridiculous because Amazon is not even remotely a monopoly. Think how many places you can go to shop for products and have them sent to your home. Basically, every company in existence these days, certainly any online company. Again, this has nothing to do with competition and everything to do with government power over the market. There's also something...
I mean, Amazon is definitely a monopoly. Let's just have, like, I'm sorry, but the ways in which they have affected the marketplace for the people who essentially guarantee they have to sell on Amazon to be able to have a market share, I don't know how you could have described this other than a monopoly.
Called the Platforms and Acquisitions Act, which basically seeks to stop things like Facebook from acquiring Instagram. And this is, again, something that would actually stomp out real competition. The ability to innovate and create in a space dominated by larger companies is provided for in part because startups and investors know they may be acquired if they create a product that's good enough to compete with those currently at the top. This, again, benefits consumers who get better products along the way. And these are just some of the
No, but the prices rise because there's no competition. Arr! If the better product is there, but it's under a competitor who can sell at a lower price than what the big corporation's selling at, that benefits the consumer on the front end because they've still got the good product and they've got the lower price. Whereas if these competitors get bought out because corporations have the power to do so because of the amount of leverage they have within the marketplace, then that doesn't benefit consumers because they can then raise the prices up once they've gotten rid of the competition. That's why the antitrust laws exist, for the fuck of the love of God.
Bad ideas currently floating around out there. Worth noting, ad nauseum here, is that none of these tech companies are monopolies. None of them. And as has always been the case throughout history, many of the tech companies that were at the top 15 years ago are now already chump change. Think of things like MySpace, Nokia, BlackBerry, Netscape. We could talk about these things all day. And even for those currently in existence, their market share often looks quite different than consumers imagine it. Do you know what the top 3 social media...
15 years ago, Facebook was still as big as it is, still as big as it is now, right? The issue is that the change in the way the market dynamics have worked over the past 15 years has lent credence to places like Facebook and Twitter to be able to curate what you can and can't see, and that's what's bad. So the regulations that are coming down on Twitter and Facebook are not necessarily monopoly legislation, but they're legislations in the way these platforms can interact with the consumer to be able to make it fair as people using the platform, because essentially have become the public sphere.
Platforms are right now? Go ahead, name them. Say it out loud, because I don't want any liars around here. They're Facebook, YouTube, and WhatsApp. I know most of y'all had Twitter and Instagram in there instead. Instagram is actually number 5. Twitter is not even in the top 10. Yet there are politicians who want you to believe it's worth throwing the First Amendment and the free market out the window because a couple well-known people got kicked off Twitter. You're seriously getting...
But if you're in favor of the First Amendment, or if you're like a First Amendment like fundamentalist, right, then you would be of the opinion that regulating these businesses such and so that they allow any opinions to be shared on their platforms and not sent to these people, then if you're some kind of fundamentalist on the First Amendment, then you would be in favour of these regulations because the corporations using their power to circumvent the First Amendment under your framework, right?
Played if you're falling for this. This is not about competition. This is about control. Companies die, markets change, innovation drives us forward, and most companies cannot be dominant for all that long. That's a good thing for us, the consumers. It's a good thing for society and for evolution. And the beautiful thing is under free market capitalism, it happens organically. The changes I point out in this episode occurred despite the fact that we hardly reside in a free market system. And yet the market still handles these things faster and better than the government can. And it does so in an unbiased way.
That's just not true. Again, the fact that we still have to continue repurchasing the same product over and over again because of the planned obsolescence that just become commonplace in literally every sector of the market. And the way in which our house prices are being driven up by private lack of competition, the ways in which our access to be able to for public transport, our prices have been going up and up because there is no such thing as competition in these markets, right? I'm absolutely down with there being some level of competition, right, and some level of market dynamics with which to the ways in which that we understand how things can be moved from how commodities can be produced and sold to the general population, right? I don't necessarily disagree with that. I do believe in market incentives to be good in some situations, right? And I don't think that I would disagree with that kind of framing of things. But there are absolutely so many different types of backdoor trading, backdoor deals, over monopolization that do nothing but to benefit corporations and do everything not to benefit consumers and to undermine competition. And that, again, that's what these laws exist for. And all you're going to do by completely getting rid of all of these laws, but again, it's basically no proper substantial evidence as to why the existence of the law is bad, rather than the application of the law being bad. All you're doing is just cocking yourself out to corporations to be able to continually control the market. It just completely undermines the entire point.
that actually benefits the people versus the politicians and crony industry insiders.
It's all of other other than that, it's all just been platitudes. It's just, this is all about control, even though I can't really prove that it is. This is all about cronyism, which is just inherent to capitalism as a system. Again, unless you can get rid of the state entirely, which has literally never been shown to work ever, and would only lead to these backroom deals just only ever existing without any kind of regulation whatsoever, and just for the benefit of everybody other than the workers and the consumer. Because again, all this happened here as well. It's all been done through the focus of the consumer, whilst also for the focus of the worker as well, in such that if you have these industry monopolies would then be able to control access the ways in which labour power is distributed as well, which I'm assuming she's not in favour of protections for unionisation and things like that too. So it's all about control. Like, you should be in favour of these things because they're capitalist and because they're free market, rather than having a look at the ways in which these things actually function on a systemic level, and how the way they affect consumers and the way they affect workers and the way they actually affect normal people, right? None of that's ever been taken into account. It's just platitude of, I believe X, Y, Z thing is good. Here's some examples of way in which laws have been enforced badly, but that's why we should just throw out all the laws entirely. Who would be convinced by this, especially as 25 minutes of her incredibly dryly, uncharismatically talking about these things?
Want to ensure competition, we should end corporate welfare, all subsidies, all bailouts, all selective tax breaks, and practices like antitrust laws. Anything else?
I mean, I don't disagree. I don't disagree with that idea that we should be removing a bunch of subsidies, for the oil industry and the corn industry and the dairy industry, because we should just let these things fucking fail, because they shouldn't exist anymore. There should be no oil, and the corn kind of less so, but that's what's led to the corn lobby essentially removing the idea that they should ban high fructose corn syrup, but that's a conversation for another time. But these subsidies absolutely should be ended. But we should also, I don't necessarily agree that all subsidies should be ended. Like, for example, I would be very much in favour of environmental, green energy subsidy, specifically because the reason why these things aren't getting pursued is because the market is dominated by a reliance on oil, which isn't going to get shifted unless, the state comes in and changes the way these things actually happen for, the benefit of, the people who are going to have to deal with the environmental fallout of the continual use of fossil fuels, which is, obviously, there's no market dynamic that's saying that's the way to go, because short-term profits are always going to override, like shareholder profits and short-term profits for the company, are always going to override the duty that they have to the people who are actually going to have to live in society 50 years down the line. So unless you have a state who sees these problems and wants to come in and intervene on the behalf of people in general, that's not going to really happen. But the idea that we should just subsidise corporations because we're being lobbied to do so by the people who want the lobbying money, they want the subsidies. That's the issue that I have, rather than the government saying that there are problems that need to be solved, and the ways in which we need to do this is by making sure that a certain industry can compete in the marketplace.
Is just letting the government pick winners and losers. And in that scenario, I promise you will always come in last place.
We should have the government picking the winner and losers by nationalising everything. Not true, but there's definitely plenty of things that should be nationalised.
That's our episode this month, guys. Thanks for tuning in, and until next month, stay based.
Well, that's the issue, right? Is that it's always been this kind of... It's always about minimising the role of government. That's all these Libertarians want to do. But it's all has to be put behind this kind of wall, this smokescreen that they've got of being in favour of the little guy, and that, or otherwise being this idea that the scary government bad, without actually properly making us understand where issues with power are and where they aren't. And again, it's all about the main issue that I really have is that it's all done from behind this veneer of only really caring about people's intentions and whether the intentions are good or not. And that doesn't fit into my moral worldview, because I don't really care whether people's intentions are good or bad. I only really care about the material impact. Yeah, it's called based. It's very, very cringe. I understand the irony of me saying that, but I mean, all it is. I mean, I before you got here, Rossi, I was pointing out, if you look at the actual video itself, you look at this little fee logo that she's got down here. If you go to her Instagram, you'll see that she's a brand ambassador for Fee Online, which is a non-profit organisation to talk about neoliberalism, right? It's to talk about It's to lobby on behalf of corporations for for fewer regulations on how these things work. Right? Like if you look at their profile here, that doesn't even come up. Interesting. If you look at their page, it's all about governments being bad. Essentially, it's all just a a group that essentially is there to just advocate for the needs of big corporations and for their interests rather than the interests of people. Well, interesting that there's a little Instagram reel called "Socialist Slab at Denmark and Finland." Let's watch this. See what she has to say again here.
With the lowest poverty are places like Denmark and Finland. It's no mystery. No advanced economy has ever achieved low poverty rates without high levels of government social spending.
So that's
True.
again, just not true. So when it comes to countries like Denmark or Finland or any of these countries that are in the Nordic kind of model that democratic socialists love to point to as their ideas and practice, some of them even rank higher on the economic.
Well, no, actually, they're social democracies. They're not socialists. They're not democratic socialists. And most Demsocs would say that they have good models for changing right now, but that's not their overall worldview. So the social democracy is better than neoliberalism, but it's not the end goal, the end solution.
Economic freedom index than the United States does. What they do differently
No, high levels of social spending is not the same as economic freedom.
than the United States is that they tax their citizens, even low and middle income people, around 50% of their.
Right, let's have a look. Finland. This is a very simple Google. How much tax do you pay in Denmark? There we go. There you go. 34.5% total tax from a salary of 300,000 kroner. Simple. Marginal tax rate 40.7%. Average tax was 34.5. There you go. I mean, by saying she's. I mean, did she say up to? I'm assuming she did. I'm assuming she did say up to 50%, which is again clever sleight of hand with the information that she's putting on board here.
Places like Denmark and Finland. It's no mystery. No advanced economy has ever achieved low poverty rates without high levels of government social spending.
So that's again just not true. So when it comes to countries like Denmark or Finland or any of these countries that are in the Nordic kind of model that democratic socialists love to point to as their ideas and practice, some of them even rank higher on the economic freedom index than the United States does. What they do differently than the United States is that they tax their citizens, even low and middle income people, around 50% of their income.
She said around 50%, so she's just straight up lying. She's just straight up incorrect.
And that is how they actually fund these giant social welfare spending.
Well, what they mostly have is a lot of state-owned enterprises. They mostly just have a reasonably large sector of public majority shareholder companies who essentially are working in the public interest at that time, which they should generate a sovereign wealth fund to be able to fund these social programs. Obviously, Norway has a lot of oil, and they have a government-owned oil company called Statoil, but that's different to Denmark and Finland.
Programs that they have. That, and because they have capitalist economies that generate a lot of wealth.
And that's also why the countries would...
So she didn't even answer the fucking question. But even then, even if her point is that they have capitalist economies that generate a lot of wealth, which is true. Social democracies are still capitalist, let's be real. Like, it's interesting how she says that, we have, like, don't have pure free market capitalism, we have crony capitalism, corporatism, which is really bad in the United States, which is just, like, how that is manifestly different than when they're talking about the social democracies in the Nordic countries, how there's, like, when everyone says that these are good examples, they say, well, they're still capitalist, but you were saying that kind of capitalism was bad previously, so, which is it? But she's also just doesn't answer the central point and also lies. So, again, she's just a lazy propagandist, like a bunch of these other people are. But it just shows, like, how much distortion and kind of smuggling in of untruths that these people have to do to try to maintain their point of view, to be able to agitate further for, cucking themselves to corporate interests rather than the interests of consumers and workers. Which, it's again, that's what they need to do. They need to be able to cloak their genuine concerns and their genuine interests behind all this rhetoric to be able to get people on board with their point of view, to try and prioritize those interests over the interests of the actual population. But Anyway, if you're a future YouTube watcher, please subscribe, hit that bell icon, leave a comment, go watch my other videos, go follow me on Twitter. Thanks for watching, I do appreciate it. Algorithms are also good. Cheers.